Riverside Naval Base, California. The training hall reeked of determination and desperation, a cocktail of sweat, worn leather, and the metallic tang of ambition that clung to every surface like morning fog. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished concrete floor, where dozens of naval personnel had gathered in a tight circle, their voices dropping to reverent whispers as they sensed something electric in the air. In the center of that circle, Lieutenant Commander Derek Hartwell prowled like a shark testing the waters, his fist still tingling from the blow he'd just delivered to Petty Officer Riley Dawson's jaw strike that should have ended the drill, should have proven his point about combat readiness. Instead, he found himself flat on his back 2 seconds later, staring at the ceiling in disbelief, wondering how the woman he'd just attacked was now standing calmly above him, completely in control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6'2" of muscle and ego wrapped in pressed whites, his chest adorned with ribbons that caught the light with each calculated step. His voice carried the kind of authority that demanded attention, the kind that silenced conversations 3 rooms away. "Today," he announced, his words echoing off the walls like gunshots, "we're going to discuss the reality of modern warfare. The cold, hard truth about what happens when theory meets chaos." Across from him stood Petty Officer First Class Riley Dawson, 5'6", lean but solid, with auburn hair pulled back in regulation style and green eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. Her uniform was immaculate, creases sharp enough to cut paper. But there was something else about her, a stillness that made seasoned sailors unconsciously straighten their spines when she passed, a thin scar traced along her jawline, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. Most people assumed it was from some training accident, a reminder of carelessness. They were wrong about everything. Hartwell had been circling her for 10 minutes, his voice growing louder with each revolution, feeding off the energy of his audience like a performer drunk on applause. "You see, folks, the Navy's changed. We've got all kinds of people wearing our uniform now. All kinds of ... perspectives." The way he said the word made it sound like a disease. Riley remained motionless, hands clasped behind her back, breathing steady and controlled. She'd learned long ago that some storms were best weathered in silence, that sometimes the strongest response was no response at all. "Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with diversity," Hartwell continued, his tone dripping with false diplomacy. "But when bullets start flying, when the water's black and the enemy's closing in, you need people who can handle the pressure. People who understand that warfare isn't a classroom exercise." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances that asked silent questions. Where is this going? How far will he push? Hartwell stopped directly in front of Riley, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small beads of sweat forming at his temples despite the air conditioning. "Petty Officer Dawson," he said, making her name sound like an accusation. "Tell me, in your extensive combat experience, what's the most important quality in a warrior?" Riley's voice came out steady, professional. "Discipline, sir. The ability to maintain composure under pressure." Hartwell laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the walls like breaking glass. "Discipline. Did you hear that, everyone? She thinks discipline wins wars." He turned to play to his audience, hands gesturing dramatically. "Tell that to the boys who stormed Normandy. Tell that to the SEALs who took down Bin Laden. Tell that to anyone who's actually seen real action." A muscle twitched in Riley's jaw so briefly that only those watching closely caught it. Otherwise, she remained perfectly still, a lighthouse in a storm of manufactured chaos. "You know what wins wars, Petty Officer?" Hartwell leaned in closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating whisper. "Aggression. Violence of action. The willingness to break things and people when the mission demands it. "Sir," Riley replied, her voice never rising above conversational level. "History suggests that strategic thinking and adaptive leadership." "History?" Hartwell exploded, spittle flying from his lips. "You want to quote history to me? I've got news for you, sweetheart. History is written by people who know how to fight, not by people who hide behind procedure manuals." The word sweetheart hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several sailors winced. A few looked at their feet, suddenly fascinated by their own bootlaces. But Riley's expression never changed. If anything, she seemed to grow calmer, more centered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when Hartwell crossed the line. "Let me show you what real combat pressure looks like," he snarled. And without warning, his fist shot forward in a controlled but deliberate strike to her jaw, not full force, but enough to make his point about violence and intimidation. The punch connected with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent hall. Riley's head snapped slightly to the side from the impact. For a heartbeat, the room held its collective breath, waiting to see tears, waiting for her to crumple, waiting for Hartwell's twisted lesson about strength to be proven. Instead, Riley slowly turned her head back to face him, a small trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth, her green eyes now carrying something that made every instinct in Hartwell's body scream danger. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new edge that cut through the stunned silence like a blade. "That was a mistake." What happened next defied physics, defied logic, defied everything the assembled sailors thought they knew about combat and control. Riley moved like water, like shadow, like inevitability itself. Her response wasn't angry or emotional, it was surgical. One moment Hartwell was standing triumphant, his point made. The next he was on the ground gasping, completely immobilized, with Riley's knee positioned precisely against his solar plexus and her hand controlling his breathing with the kind of pressure that spoke of training beyond anything taught in standard naval courses. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the absence of sound itself, as if the entire base had suddenly been placed in a vacuum. "Breathe slowly." "Sir," Riley said calmly, as if she were giving directions to the commissary. "The pressure you're feeling will pass if you don't fight it." Hartwell's eyes were wide with shock and something approaching terror. He tried to speak, tried to move, tried to understand how his world had been turned completely upside down in less than 3 seconds. As she gradually released the pressure and stepped back, allowing him to scramble to his feet with whatever shreds of dignity remained. Not one person in that room could have predicted what they were about to learn about the quiet woman with the scar on her jaw. The real story was just beginning. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Valor Chronicles so you never miss these incredible tales of courage and honor. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Because this story is about to take a turn that will change everything you think you know about strength, respect, and the warriors who walk among us in silence. 3 months earlier, Petty Officer First Class Riley Dawson had arrived at Riverside Naval Base like morning mist rolling in from the Pacific, quiet, unremarkable, and easily overlooked. Her transfer orders bore the standard Navy letterhead, stamped with routine approvals and filed under administrative reassignment, the kind of paperwork that generated no questions because it seemed designed not to. She carried a single duffel bag and a sea chest that had seen better decades. No fanfare, no welcome committee, just another sailor rotating through the system like countless others before her. The duty officer barely glanced up from this crossword puzzle when she signed in, mumbling directions to Building C and reminding her that chow ended at 1900 hours. Riley found her assigned bunk in the female enlisted Quarters a narrow space between two junior sailors who were more interested in their phones than their new roommate. She unpacked with methodical precision, each item finding its designated place in her locker. Toothbrush regulation. Soap regulation. A small digital clock that she positioned exactly 3 inches from the left corner. No photographs. No personal mementos. Nothing that hinted at a life beyond these walls. By morning, she had established a routine that would define her next 3 months. Up at 0430, before the base stirred. A 5-mile run along the perimeter road while the Pacific fog still clung to the chain-link fence. Shower, uniform inspection in the mirror, then to the mess hall for black coffee and oatmeal. At 28. Riley was older than most of the enlisted personnel around her, though you wouldn't know it from her posture or her face. There was something ageless about her stillness, the way she moved through spaces without disturbing the air around her. She spoke when spoken to, followed orders without question, and never complained about duty assignments. The other sailors noticed her, of course. It was impossible not to. There was something about her presence that made rooms feel different when she entered them. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted, became more purposeful. Jokes landed softer. Complaints about training or weather seemed somehow smaller. "She's quiet," said Seaman First Class Jake Morrison during one late-night bull session. "Quiet in a way that makes you want to whisper." "Maybe she's shy," offered Seaman Taylor Brooks, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it herself. "That's not shy," Morrison replied, glancing toward Riley's bunk where she sat reading a worn paperback. "That's something else." Riley never corrected their assumptions or offered explanations for her reserved nature. When asked about her previous assignment, she would simply say, "East Coast," and change the subject. When pressed about her hometown, she'd mention Pennsylvania, with the kind of finality that discouraged follow-up questions. The scar along her jawline drew occasional glances, but no one dared ask about it directly. It wasn't disfiguring, just noticeable, a thin line that caught the light when she turned her head certain ways. Some speculated it was from a car accident. Others whispered about a training mishap. Riley never volunteered the truth. What she did volunteer was competence. Pure, understated excellence that revealed itself in small ways. When a new sailor struggled with knot tying during seamanship training, Riley would quietly position herself nearby, her fingers demonstrating the proper technique without making a show of it. When equipment malfunctioned, she had an uncanny ability to diagnose problems that left maintenance chiefs scratching their heads. "How'd you know the bearing was shot?" Chief Petty Officer Williams asked after she'd identified a failing component in the ship's ventilation system. "Sound was off," Riley replied simply. "Frequency was wrong." Williams stared at her for a long moment. "You got good ears, Dawson." "Yes, Chief." But it wasn't just her ears. Riley seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of systems, people, and situations that went beyond normal training. She could spot potential conflicts between sailors before they escalated into actual problems. She knew when someone was struggling with homesickness or financial troubles, often appearing with exactly the right word or gesture to help. Never intrusive. Never dramatic. Just present. Lieutenant Commander Hartwell noticed her during her second week aboard. He was conducting a routine inspection of the enlisted quarters when he saw Riley standing at attention beside her perfectly organized bunk space. Every corner was regulation, every fold precise, every surface spotless. "Name?" He barked, though he already knew from the roster. "Petty Officer First Class Dawson, sir. Previous assignment?" "Naval Station Norfolk, sir." Hartwell flipped through her service record, noting the commendations for excellence, the spotless disciplinary record, the recommendations from previous commanding officers. All perfect. Too perfect. "Says here you were stationed at Norfolk for 2 years. What was your primary duty?" "Administrative support, sir." personnel records and logistics coordination. A desk job. That explained the soft hands and the pale complexion that suggested more time under fluorescent lights than Pacific sun. Hartwell felt a familiar mixture of disappointment and contempt. Another paper pusher, wearing the uniform without understanding its weight. Well, Petty Officer, things work differently here. This is a training command. We prepare warriors, not file clerks. Think you can handle that? Riley's green eyes never wavered. Yes, sir, we'll see. From that moment, Hartwell made it his mission to test her. Not maliciously, at least not at first, but with the casual dismissiveness he reserved for sailors he deemed soft. He assigned her extra duty. He questioned her performance during routine tasks. He made subtle comments about personnel types who thought they understood operational Navy. Riley absorbed it all without complaint. She completed every assignment perfectly and on time. She never argued, never showed frustration, never gave him the reaction he seemed to be hunting for, which only made him push harder. The other sailors began to notice the pattern. The way Hartwell's voice would sharpen when he addressed Riley, the way he would find fault with work that met every standard, the way he seemed to be trying to break something in her that refused to bend. He's got it in for you, Morrison said one evening as they cleaned the mess hall together. Riley continued wiping tables with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. The lieutenant commander has high standards. That's not high standards. That's personal. Riley paused, her cloth stilling for just a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality that Morrison had never heard before. Not anger, not resignation, but something deeper. Something that suggested she'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. Some people need to prove things to themselves, she said quietly. It usually works itself out. Morrison wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her tone discouraged questions. Instead, he finished his section in silence, wondering not for the first time who Riley Dawson really was beneath that calm surface. 3 weeks later, during what was supposed to be a routine combat readiness drill, Morrison would get his answer, and so would Lieutenant Commander Derek Hartwell. Lieutenant Commander Derek Hartwell commanded respect the way some men commanded ships, with absolute certainty that the universe owed him deference. At 34, he had climbed the naval hierarchy with the methodical precision of someone who understood that perception often mattered more than performance. His service record gleamed with the kind of assignments that looked impressive on paper: staff positions at the Pentagon, attached duty in friendly nations, training commands where the greatest danger came from paper cuts and bruised egos. He had never fired a shot in anger, never felt the deck of a ship roll beneath his feet during a storm that threatened to swallow the vessel whole, never looked into the eyes of an enemy who wanted him dead. But Derek Hartwell had mastered something far more valuable in peacetime: the art of appearing indispensable while avoiding actual risk. Riverside Naval Base suited him perfectly. As the senior training officer for combat readiness programs, he wielded authority over hundreds of sailors who rotated through his courses each year. Most were young, impressionable, and eager to please. They hung on his words during lectures about tactical awareness and battlefield psychology, never questioning whether their instructor had actually experienced the scenarios he described with such vivid detail. Hartwell had arrived at Riverside 18 months earlier with fanfare, befitting his reputation. His previous commanding officer had written glowing recommendations about his innovative training methodologies and inspirational leadership style. What those recommendations didn't mention was that Hartwell's innovations mostly involved borrowing techniques from other instructors, and his inspiration came from a carefully cultivated image rather than genuine expertise. The facade worked because Hartwell understood his audience. Young sailors wanted to believe in heroes. They needed to see strength and confidence in their leaders, even if that strength was more theatrical than tactical. So he gave them what they wanted: a commanding presence, unwavering certainty, and the kind of swagger that looked like competence from a distance. His office walls displayed photographs from various training exercises, always with Hartwell positioned prominently in the foreground. Citations for outstanding performance hung in precise rows, each frame polished to a mirror shine. A bookshelf showcased military classics that he referenced frequently in conversation, but had never actually read cover to cover. Everything calculated to reinforce the image of a warrior scholar. The truth was more mundane. Hartwell had grown up in suburban Connecticut, the son of a successful insurance executive who expected excellence, but settled for the appearance of it. Derek learned early that results mattered less than presentation, that confidence could substitute for competence if delivered with sufficient conviction. The Naval Academy had reinforced these lessons, rewarding cadets who looked the part of future officers while quietly shuffling aside those who questioned too deeply or performed too honestly. His classmates had scattered across the fleet after graduation, some to submarine duty, others to carrier operations, a few to the dangerous but prestigious special warfare communities. Hartwell had chosen the safer path of staff assignments and training commands, where his natural charisma and political instincts served him well. He networked with the right officers, volunteered for the right committees, and carefully avoided any assignment that might expose his limitations. By the time he reached Riverside, Hartwell had convinced himself that his version of leadership was not only legitimate, but superior to the crude heroics of sailors who confused recklessness with courage. He spoke dismissively of glory hounds and adrenaline junkies who sought combat assignments, positioning himself as the thoughtful professional who understood that modern warfare required intellectual sophistication rather than physical prowess. His training philosophy reflected this worldview. Hartwell believed that mental toughness could be taught through psychological pressure rather than physical challenge. He specialized in breaking down what he saw as the naive confidence of new sailors, stripping away their illusions about military service through carefully applied stress and humiliation. Only then, he argued, could they be rebuilt into effective warriors. The technique worked well enough with 18-year-old recruits fresh from basic training. They arrived at Riverside already conditioned to accept harsh treatment as part of military tradition, interpreting Hartwell's psychological games as legitimate preparation for the challenges ahead. Most emerged from his programs more compliant and less questioning, which supervisors interpreted as improved discipline. But Hartwell's methods had never been tested against someone like Riley Dawson. When she first appeared on his roster, he saw only what her personnel file revealed: another administrative transfer, probably seeking to pad her record with training command experience before rotating back to a desk job. Her age suggested someone who had avoided the demanding sea billets that forged real sailors, choosing instead the comfortable predictability of shore duty, perfect material for his standard treatment. The first signs of resistance came during her second week at Riverside. Hartwell had assigned her to inventory duty as punishment for what he claimed was insufficient attention. During his lecture on maritime combat tactics, most sailors would have grumbled privately while completing the tedious task, accepting the arbitrary nature of military hierarchy. Riley simply did the work perfectly, without complaint. When she submitted the completed inventory, it was more thorough and accurate than anything his staff had produced in months. She had even identified discrepancies that previous inventories had missed, noting them in precise marginalia that suggested far more familiarity with military logistics than any file clerk should possess. Hartwell found himself irritated rather than pleased. Compliance was valuable, but this level of competence felt somehow insubordinate. It suggested that Riley viewed his punishment as merely another task to be completed rather than a lesson to be absorbed. Her calm acceptance denied him the satisfaction of seeing his authority acknowledged through appropriate deference. He escalated. Extra duties, unexpected inspections, Public criticism for minor infractions that other sailors committed without consequence. Each time, Riley absorbed the treatment with the same unflappable composure, completing every assignment to a standard that made further criticism impossible. Her fellow sailors began to notice. They saw the pattern of selective harassment, but also witnessed Riley's response or lack thereof. She never complained, never sought sympathy, never tried to rally support against what was obviously unfair treatment. If anything, she seemed to grow calmer under pressure, as if Hartwell's antagonism was confirming something she already knew about him. This only made him angrier. The breaking point came during a routine training evolution involving simulated shipboard emergencies. Hartwell had designed the exercise to test sailors' responses to multiple simultaneous crises, deliberately creating chaos to see who would crack under pressure. It was one of his favorite demonstrations, allowing him to play the role of experienced commander, guiding panicked subordinates through disaster. Riley's performance destroyed the entire premise of the exercise. While other sailors rushed around following Hartwell's increasingly frantic instructions, Riley moved through the chaos with systematic efficiency. She prioritized tasks based on actual rather than apparent urgency, coordinating responses with other sailors through quiet gestures and minimal verbal communication. Within minutes, she had effectively taken control of the evolution without ever raising her voice or challenging Hartwell's authority directly. The other sailors naturally gravitated toward her leadership, finding her calm competence more reassuring than Hartwell's dramatic urgency. By the time the exercise concluded, Riley had orchestrated a response that would have earned commendation in actual emergency conditions. Hartwell watched this unfold with growing fury. His carefully planned demonstration had been hijacked by a file clerk who somehow understood emergency procedures better than officers with years of supposed experience. Worse, she had made him look incompetent in front of subordinates who were supposed to view him as the ultimate authority on crisis management. That night, alone in his quarters, Derek Hartwell made a decision that would define the remainder of his naval career. Riley Dawson represented everything he despised about the modern military: quiet competence that threatened loud authority, substance that exposed his lack of it, genuine leadership that highlighted his reliance on rank rather than respect. She had to be broken, publicly, decisively, in a way that would restore the natural order and remind everyone present that authority flowed from position rather than ability. He began planning the demonstration that would accomplish this goal, never suspecting that he was about to discover exactly how dangerous it could be to corner someone who had spent years learning to survive against impossible odds. The combat readiness drill scheduled for the following week would provide the perfect opportunity. In front of a full audience, with official sanction to apply physical pressure, Hartwell would finally expose Riley Dawson as just another paper pusher, playing at being a warrior. It never occurred to him that he might be the one getting exposed. The harassment began with surgical precision, the kind of calculated cruelty that Hartwell had perfected over years of breaking down subordinates who threatened his carefully constructed authority. It started small comments that could be dismissed as routine military tough love if anyone questioned them, but carried enough venom to poison the atmosphere around Riley's daily routine. Dawson, front and center, became Hartwell's favorite phrase during morning formations. He would single her out for uniform infractions that existed only in his imagination: a thread allegedly out of place, boots that weren't quite reflective enough, hair that exceeded regulation length by microscopic amounts. Other sailors would stand perfectly still as he circled Riley like a predator, his voice carrying just far enough for everyone to hear his manufactured disappointments. "See, this is what happens when you get comfortable behind a desk," he would announce, adjusting her collar with unnecessary force. Standards slip. Attention to detail deteriorates. You forget that every thread, every shine, every regulation exists for a reason. Riley never flinched during these performances. She would stand at rigid attention, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Hartwell's shoulder, absorbing his criticism with the kind of stillness that made witnesses uncomfortable. Her lack of reaction only seemed to fuel his creativity, pushing him to find new ways to provoke the response he was hunting for. The duty assignments came next. Kitchen patrol during off hours. Inventory checks that lasted well past normal working time. Cleaning details that had Riley scrubbing floors and polishing fixtures that other sailors had already maintained to standard. Each task was accompanied by deadlines that seemed designed to ensure failure. But Riley completed them all with the same methodical excellence she brought to everything else. "Trying to make the rest of us look bad, Dawson?" Seaman Morrison asked one evening as he found her organizing supply closets at nearly midnight. Riley paused in her work, considering the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Just doing what needs doing." Morrison studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light, noting the way exhaustion had carved faint lines around her eyes, but hadn't diminished the alertness in her gaze. "You know he's targeting you, right? This isn't normal military hazing, I've noticed. So why don't you say something? File a complaint? Talk to someone higher up the chain?" Riley resumed organizing supplies, her movements precise despite the late hour. "Because he hasn't done anything worth complaining about yet. Demanding high standards isn't harassment, even when the standards are selectively applied. Yet?" Morrison caught the implication. "You think he's going to escalate?" Rayleigh's hands stilled for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality that Morrison had never heard before, not resignation or fear, but the calm certainty of someone who had played this game before and knew all the moves. Men like Lieutenant Commander Hartwell always escalate. They have to. Their authority depends on breaking people who make them look small by comparison. When normal pressure doesn't work, they try harder until they either succeed or expose themselves. Morrison wanted to ask what she meant by men like Hartwell, and how she knew so much about their behavior patterns. But something in her tone discouraged questions. Instead, he helped her finish the supply organization, working in companionable silence until the task was complete. As the weeks passed, Hartwell's campaign intensified. He began interrupting Riley during routine activities, calling her away from meals to handle urgent tasks that invariably proved to be busy work. He assigned her to training exercises designed to highlight her supposed inexperience, pairing her with sailors who had been instructed to treat her as a liability rather than a teammate. The psychological pressure was relentless and expertly applied. During classroom sessions on tactical awareness, Hartwell would pose questions specifically designed to expose gaps in Riley's supposed combat experience. When she answered correctly, which she invariably did, he would dismiss her responses as textbook knowledge that had no bearing on real-world situations. "Anyone can memorize a manual, Dawson," he would say with theatrical disappointment. "But when the bullets start flying and your teammates are depending on you, what matters is instinct, training, experience that comes from actually being there when it counts." The other sailors began to shift uncomfortably during these sessions. They could see the pattern, could recognize the unfairness of targeting one person so consistently. But they also understood the implicit message: challenge Hartwell's authority and become the next target. Most kept their heads down and their opinions to themselves. Riley continued to absorb everything without visible reaction. She completed every assignment, answered every question, endured every public criticism with the same unshakable composure. If anything, she seemed to grow calmer under pressure, as if Hartwell's antagonism was providing her with useful information about his character and intentions. This only made him more determined to break. The breakthrough came during a night training exercise designed to simulate shipboard damage control procedures. Hartwell had arranged for multiple simultaneous emergencies to test the sailors' ability to prioritize and coordinate under stress. Smoke machines, flashing lights, and recorded alarm sounds created an atmosphere of controlled chaos while instructors observed and evaluated responses. Riley's performance was flawless. She moved through the simulated emergency with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested extensive experience with actual crisis situations. While other sailors hesitated or followed prescribed procedures, Riley adapted to changing conditions with an intuitive understanding of priorities that impressed even the veteran chief petty officers observing the exercise. Where the hell did she learn to do that? Chief Williams muttered to his colleague as they watched Riley coordinate a complex damage control evolution with minimal verbal communication. "Beats me," Chief Rodriguez replied. "But that's not amateur hour. That's muscle memory from someone who's been there." Hartwell watched the exercise with growing frustration and anger. His carefully designed scenario was supposed to overwhelm inexperienced sailors, forcing them to rely on his guidance to navigate the chaos. Instead, Riley had effectively taken operational control of the entire evolution, turning what should have been a demonstration of his expertise into a showcase of her competence. When the exercise concluded, Hartwell's critique focused entirely on Riley's failure to follow established chain of command and inappropriate assumption of leadership responsibilities. The charges were technically accurate but missed the point entirely. Her actions had been effective precisely because she had prioritized results over procedure. The other sailors exchanged glances as Hartwell dressed down Riley for succeeding too effectively. They were beginning to understand that their instructor's problem with Petty Officer Dawson had nothing to do with her performance, and everything to do with his own insecurity. That night, Hartwell sat in his quarters staring at Riley's personnel file, searching for some explanation for her inexplicable competence. The record showed nothing but routine administrative assignments, standard evaluations, and the kind of unremarkable career path typical of sailors who avoided challenging billets. Yet her behavior suggested training and experience that went far beyond anything documented in official channels. He began making phone calls to contacts at her previous duty stations, fishing for information about her background and performance. The responses were uniformly positive but frustratingly vague. Everyone remembered Riley as competent and professional, but no one could provide specific details about her duties or capabilities. One conversation stood out. A chief petty officer at Norfolk had paused when Hartwell mentioned Riley's name, then asked, "You sure you're talking about the right Dawson? Because the one I knew wasn't someone you'd want to mess with." When pressed for details, the chief had simply said, "Just treat her with respect, sir. Trust me on that." The warning only intensified Hartwell's determination to expose what he saw as an elaborate deception. Riley Dawson was hiding something, and he intended to drag it into the light in the most public and humiliating way possible. The combat readiness demonstration scheduled for the following week would provide the perfect opportunity. With a full audience of sailors and instructors, Hartwell would finally strip away Riley's mask and reveal the fraud beneath. He had no idea that the mask was about to be torn away from an entirely different face. The whispers started in the mess hall, carried by the kind of undercurrent that flows through military installations when something doesn't add up. Sailors have an instinct for detecting anomalies, and Riley Dawson had become the base's most intriguing puzzle. "Did you see how she handled that fire drill last week?" Seaman Brooks whispered to her table mates over lukewarm coffee and regulation scrambled eggs. "I've been through 3 different damage control courses, and I've never seen anyone move like that." "Like what?" asked Petty Officer Martinez, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Like she'd done it for real. 100 times. In actual emergencies where people die if you screw up." The conversation died as Riley entered the mess hall, carrying her tray with the same measured precision she applied to everything else. She found an empty table near the window and ate in silence, occasionally glancing at the morning fog that rolled across the base like a gray blanket. As always, she seemed completely unaware of the attention she drew. The way conversations shifted when she passed. Seaman Morrison had been watching her more closely than the others. Something about Riley reminded him of his grandfather, a Korea veteran who had carried himself with the same quiet stillness. His grandfather had never talked about the war, but Morrison had learned to recognize the particular alertness of someone who had seen too much and survived by being ready for anything. Riley had that same watchfulness. The way her eyes swept a room when she entered, cataloging exits and potential threats. The way she positioned herself with clear sight lines and her back to solid walls. The way she listened to conversations happening 3 tables away while appearing completely focused on her meal. "She's prior service," Morrison announced to his bunkmates that evening. "Has to be. Nobody learns that kind of situational awareness from administrative work." "Her file says she's been Navy the whole time," countered Seaman Davis. "Enlisted straight out of high school. Worked her way up through the ratings. Nothing special about it. Files can be scrubbed," Morrison said quietly. "Especially if someone's coming out of classified programs." The idea hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Everyone had heard rumors about sailors who disappeared into black programs, their records sanitized and their real histories buried under layers of security clearances. Most dismissed such stories as wishful thinking from bored sailors who wanted to believe their mundane service connected them to something greater. But Riley's behavior suggested possibilities that her personnel file couldn't explain. Chief Petty Officer Williams had noticed the discrepancies too. 30 years in the Navy had taught him to read people, and Riley Dawson didn't read like someone whose most dangerous assignment had been filing requisition forms. During the previous week's seamanship training, she had demonstrated knowledge of advanced navigation techniques that weren't taught outside specialized schools. When asked where she'd learned to plot courses using celestial navigation, she had simply said, "Previous training," and moved on to help a struggling sailor. Williams had tried calling contacts at her previous duty stations, fishing for information about her background. The responses were oddly consistent. Everyone remembered Riley as competent and reliable, but no one could provide specific details about her assignments or capabilities. It was as if her colleagues had been coached to give generic positive assessments without revealing anything substantive. More troubling were the conversations that ended abruptly when he mentioned. As the weeks passed, Hartwell's campaign intensified. He began interrupting Riley during routine activities, calling her away from meals to handle urgent tasks that invariably proved to be busy work. He assigned her to training exercises designed to highlight her supposed inexperience, pairing her with sailors who had been instructed to treat her as a liability rather than a teammate. The psychological pressure was relentless and expertly applied. During classroom sessions on tactical awareness, Hartwell would pose questions specifically to Williams. Had seen similar sanitization before, usually involving sailors who had rotated through special warfare communities or intelligence programs. The bureaucratic euphemism was compartmentalized operational history, which meant someone had done things that officially never happened in places that officially didn't exist. If Riley was coming out of that world, it explained her competence and her composure. It also explained why Lieutenant Commander Hartwell's campaign of harassment was so profoundly misguided. The thought made Williams uncomfortable. Hartwell was his superior officer, but he was also someone whose own combat experience consisted entirely of PowerPoint presentations and training scenarios. If he was unknowingly targeting someone with actual operational background, the situation could become extremely problematic for everyone involved. Williams decided to test his theory during the following week's combat training evolution. Instead of the standard curriculum, he arranged for an advanced scenario involving simulated close-quarters combat and tactical decision-making under pressure. If Riley was what he suspected, she would demonstrate capabilities that her file couldn't account for. If she wasn't, the exercise would simply be more challenging training. The evolution took place in a mock shipboard environment designed to replicate the cramped conditions and limited visibility of actual combat situations. Sailors were equipped with training weapons and protective gear, then tasked with clearing hostile forces from multiple compartments. While managing simulated battle damage, Riley's performance eliminated any remaining doubts about her background. She moved through the exercise with the fluid precision of someone who had done this work in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. Her tactical awareness was flawless, her weapon handling instinctive, her decision-making rapid and accurate. Most tellingly, she displayed the kind of calm focus that came only from extensive experience in high-stress situations. "Jesus Christ," muttered Chief Rodriguez as they observed the exercise from the control room. "Where the hell did she learn to do that?" Williams watched Riley coordinate her team's advance through a particularly challenging section of the course, noting the way she used hand signals and controlled her breathing. "Somewhere that doesn't exist on any organizational chart," he replied quietly. The other sailors participating in the exercise noticed the difference immediately. Riley wasn't just competent, she was operating at a level that made their standard training seem like amateur theater. Her teammates began deferring to her judgment automatically, recognizing expertise that transcended rank or official authority. When the exercise concluded, Williams pulled Riley aside for what he described as a routine debrief. They walked to his office in silence, Riley's expression giving nothing away about her thoughts on what had just transpired. "That was impressive work out there, Dawson," Williams began carefully. "You've got skills that go beyond standard naval training." Riley's response was perfectly measured. "Thank you, Chief. I try to stay current on tactical procedures." "Those weren't procedures," Williams said bluntly. "That was muscle memory. The kind you develop through repetition under actual threat conditions." For the first time since he'd known her, Riley's composure flickered slightly. It lasted only a second, but Williams caught the brief calculation in her eyes as she considered how to respond to his implicit question. "I take training seriously," she said finally. Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Look, Dawson, I don't know what your real story is, and frankly, I don't need to know. But you should be aware that Lieutenant Commander Hartwell has been asking questions about your background, making phone calls to your previous stations." Riley's expression didn't change, but Williams sensed a subtle shift in her attention. "Is there something specific the Lieutenant Commander needs to know, Chief?" "That's not my call to make. But I will say this, if you've got operational experience that isn't reflected in your file, you might want to consider having a conversation with someone before Hartwell pushes this situation into territory that nobody wants to explore." Riley was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Williams's shoulder. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that confirmed everything he had suspected about her. "Some conversations can't be had without compromising things that are bigger than any individual assignment," she said softly. "I appreciate your concern, Chief, but Lieutenant Commander Hartwell will learn what he needs to learn when the time is right." The words sent a chill down Williams's spine. They weren't a threat exactly, but they carried the quiet certainty of someone who understood consequences that he could only imagine. As Riley left his office, Williams found himself hoping that Derek Hartwell would recognize the warning signs before he pushed too far. Because if his suspicions about Petty Officer Dawson were correct, the lieutenant commander was about to discover that some people couldn't be broken by conventional pressure. Some people had already been tested by forces that made military hazing look like playground games. And some secrets had ways of protecting themselves when threatened by those who didn't understand. Their true nature, the pressure campaign reached its crescendo during a particularly humid Thursday afternoon when the Pacific Marine layer trapped the base under a blanket of oppressive heat and stagnant air. Hartwell had been building toward this moment for weeks, carefully orchestrating a series of increasingly public confrontations designed to expose what he was certain was Riley's fundamental weakness. The setting was perfect for his purposes. The main training facility during peak hours, when nearly 200 sailors would be rotating through various combat readiness exercises. Maximum visibility for maximum impact. Hartwell had even arranged for several visiting officers from other commands to observe, ensuring that Riley's inevitable breakdown would have witnesses whose reports would follow her throughout the remainder of her naval career. Today we're going to discuss the psychological aspects of combat effectiveness, Hartwell announced to the assembled sailors, his voice carrying the theatrical authority he had perfected over months of similar performances. Specifically, how stress reveals character and how character determines survival in actual combat situations. Riley stood in formation with the other sailors, her uniform immaculate despite the oppressive heat, her posture erect and unwavering. Around her, sweat-soaked colleagues shifted restlessly as Hartwell paced the front of the formation, building toward whatever demonstration he had planned. Some people, Hartwell continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled sailors before settling deliberately on Riley, carry themselves with confidence that comes from genuine experience. Others project an image of competence that crumbles under real pressure. Today, we're going to explore the difference. The words carried enough menace to make several sailors exchange worried glances. They had seen Hartwell's campaigns before, watched him systematically target individuals he perceived as threats to his authority. But this felt different, more personal, more vicious than his usual displays of dominance. Seaman Morrison, standing 2 rows behind Riley, felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. He had tried to warn her about Hartwell's intentions, but Riley had listened to his concerns with the same calm attention she gave everything else, neither dismissing his fears nor showing any sign that they troubled her. Fear, you see, is a teacher, Hartwell lectured, warming to his theme. It strips away pretense and reveals truth. Under sufficient stress, people show you exactly who they are beneath whatever image they've constructed. The weak reveal their weakness. The strong reveal their strength. And those who've been pretending. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the implication hang in the still air. Chief Williams watched from the observation deck, his unease growing with each word. He had tried to warn Hartwell about pushing too hard, suggesting that Riley might not be the soft target he assumed. But Hartwell had dismissed his concerns, interpreting Williams's warnings as evidence of the same weakness he saw in Riley herself. "Petty Officer Dawson," Hartwell called out, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. Front and center. Riley stepped forward without hesitation, her movements precise and controlled. She positioned herself exactly where Hartwell indicated, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed straight ahead. If she felt any apprehension about what was coming, her face gave no indication. "Tell me, Petty Officer," Hartwell said, circling her slowly, "what do you think is the most important quality in a combat leader?" "Adaptability, sir," Riley replied without hesitation. "The ability to adjust tactics based on changing conditions while maintaining mission focus." Hartwell's smile was predatory. Adaptability. Interesting choice. And where exactly did you develop this insight into combat leadership? During your extensive administrative career? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the formation. The visiting officers leaned forward slightly, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. "Through observation and study, sir," Riley answered, her voice remaining perfectly level. Leadership principles are consistent across different operational environments. Observation and study, Hartwell repeated mockingly. Theoretical knowledge. Tell me, have you ever been in actual combat, Petty Officer? Ever felt bullets passing close enough to count? Ever had to make life or death decisions while people around you were dying? Riley's silence stretched for several heartbeats. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality that made several sailors unconsciously straighten their spines. I've been in challenging situations. Sir, Hartwell sensed an opening and pressed forward. Challenging situations. Like what? Difficult paperwork? Demanding filing deadlines? Budget reconciliation under pressure? The mockery in his voice was unmistakable now, and several sailors shifted uncomfortably. This had moved beyond training into something that felt personal and cruel. Sir, Riley said quietly, I prefer not to discuss specific operational details in an open forum. The response was perfect, professional, appropriate, and completely reasonable. It was also exactly what Hartwell had hoped for, because it could be twisted to support his narrative about Riley's supposed deception. Operational details, he laughed, throwing his hands up in theatrical exasperation. Listen to that, everyone. She talks like someone with actual operational experience, uses the right terminology, maintains the proper mysterious silence about classified activities. He leaned closer to Riley, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried to every corner of the facility. Except we all know what your real operational experience consists of, don't we? Riley remained silent, but something in her stillness changed. It was subtle, a slight shift in the way she held her shoulders, a barely perceptible alteration in her breathing pattern. Chief Williams noticed it from his observation point and felt a chill run down his spine, despite the oppressive heat. You see, Hartwell announced to his audience, this is what happens when people are allowed to build false reputations based on mystery rather than verified accomplishment. They start believing their own stories. They begin to think that silence equals competence, that withholding information makes them seem more experienced than they actually are. He was playing to the crowd now, feeding off their discomfort and his own growing excitement. This was going exactly as he had planned. Riley was being systematically exposed as a fraud in front of witnesses who would carry the story throughout the fleet. But reality has a way of asserting itself, Hartwell continued. When real pressure is applied, when actual stress is introduced, the pretense collapses. The mask comes off, and we see people for what they really are. Riley's voice, when she finally spoke, was so quiet that the entire formation had to strain to hear it. Sir, I would recommend reconsidering this approach. The words were spoken without emotion, without threat, without any obvious challenge to Hartwell's authority. But something in their tone made the visiting officers exchange glances and Chief Williams take an unconscious step forward. Hartwell, however, interpreted Riley's restraint as confirmation of his theory about her character. Recommendation noted and dismissed, Petty Officer. You seem to think that projecting calm makes you appear competent. Let me show you what happens when that calm is actually tested. What happened next would be analyzed and debated in naval circles for years afterward. Hartwell reached out and grabbed Riley's shoulder, his grip deliberately rough and intimidating. Not violent enough to be assault, but far beyond anything appropriate for a training demonstration. Riley's response was immediate and minimal. She simply shifted her weight slightly, repositioned her feet by perhaps 6 inches. And somehow Hartwell found himself off balance, stumbling backward with his arm extended at an awkward angle that sent sharp pain shooting through his shoulder. Sir, Riley said calmly, please maintain appropriate distance. The exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, but it changed everything. Hartwell stood there holding his shoulder, trying to understand how a simple intimidation tactic had resulted in him being the one in pain and off balance. Around them, 200 sailors watched in stunned silence as their understanding of the situation underwent a fundamental revision. Riley remained exactly where she had been, hands clasped behind her back, expression unchanged. But now her stillness looked less like passivity and more like restraint. Her calm seemed less like weakness and more like the kind of control that came from extensive practice managing dangerous situations. Chief Williams found himself holding his breath, waiting to see whether Hartwell would be smart enough to recognize the warning he had just received. But as he watched the lieutenant commander's face flush with embarrassment and rage, Williams realized that Derek Hartwell was about to make the biggest mistake of his naval career, and Riley Dawson was about to stop pretending to be someone she wasn't. The demonstration Hartwell orchestrated for maximum humiliation began with clinical precision. He had spent days planning every detail, from the positioning of observers to the specific sequence of exercises that would systematically expose Riley's supposed incompetence. The main training facility had been transformed into a theater of psychological warfare, with bleacher seating arranged to ensure that every witness would have a clear view of Riley's inevitable breakdown. Combat readiness assessment, Hartwell announced to the assembled crowd, which now included not only the regular training personnel, but also visiting officers from 3 other naval installations. Word had somehow spread about the afternoon's planned demonstration, drawing spectators who sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Riley stood in the center of the mat, surrounded by a circle of sailors who had been carefully briefed on their roles in Hartwell's orchestrated scenario. Each had been given specific instructions, designed to create overwhelming pressure through coordinated harassment and physical intimidation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Apply sufficient stress to break Riley's composure, then use her inevitable emotional response as proof of her unfitness for military service. Today we're going to test Petty Officer Dawson's combat readiness under realistic stress conditions, Hartwell explained to his audience, his voice carrying the authority of someone conducting legitimate training rather than personal vendetta. In actual combat situations, sailors must maintain effectiveness despite physical exhaustion, psychological pressure, and immediate threats to their safety. We're going to simulate those conditions. Chief Williams felt his stomach clench as he watched from the observation deck. Every instinct developed over 3 decades of naval service was screaming warnings about the scenario unfolding below. Hartwell was crossing lines that separated legitimate training from sanctioned abuse. But he was doing it with enough official veneer to make intervention difficult. The first phase involved physical conditioning designed to exhaust Riley before the psychological pressure began. Extended calisthenics in the humid training bay, carrying heavy equipment across obstacle courses, repeated sprints while wearing full combat gear. Each exercise was within normal training parameters individually, but the cumulative effect was deliberately punishing. Riley completed every task without complaint, her breathing controlled and her movements efficient despite the obvious fatigue. She didn't waste energy on unnecessary motion or dramatic displays of effort, simply accomplishing each requirement with the minimum expenditure necessary to meet the standard. Hartwell watched her performance with growing frustration. The physical exhaustion was supposed to weaken her mental defenses, making her vulnerable to the psychological tactics he planned to employ next. Instead, Riley seemed to be settling into a rhythm that suggested extensive familiarity with sustained physical stress. Phase 2, Hartwell announced, signaling for the next stage of his demonstration. Psychological pressure assessment. This was where his planning became truly vicious. The sailors surrounding Riley had been instructed to engage in verbal harassment designed to provoke an emotional response. Not outright abuse that would be too easily challenged, but a sustained campaign of mockery, dismissal, and personal attacks disguised as legitimate stress testing. "Come on, desk jockey," one sailor taunted as Riley performed push-ups on command. My grandmother could do better than that. Bet she's never done a real push-up in her life, another added. Probably had some guy doing them for her during physical fitness tests. Riley's response was to maintain perfect form while increasing her pace slightly, demonstrating that the harassment was having the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of breaking her concentration, the verbal abuse seemed to enhance her focus. Hartwell escalated the verbal attacks, encouraging his participants to become more personal and more vicious. Comments about her appearance, her competence, her right to wear the uniform. Each insult was calculated to find some psychological pressure point that would crack her composure. I heard she's only here because the Navy needs to meet some quota, one sailor said, loud enough for the entire facility to hear. Diversity hire who's never earned anything she's been given. Riley completed her set of exercises and moved to the next station without acknowledging the comment. Her face remained completely neutral, showing no sign that she had even heard the harassment, much less been affected by it. The visiting officers began shifting uncomfortably as they recognized the true nature of what they were witnessing. This wasn't training, it was systematic psychological abuse disguised as professional development. Several exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they were documenting the proceedings for later review. Seaman Morrison, forced to participate in the harassment as part of his regular training duties, found himself unable to deliver the scripted insults with any conviction. He could see what the others couldn't, or what they were choosing to ignore. Riley wasn't struggling to maintain composure under pressure. She was demonstrating a level of stress management that spoke to extensive experience with far more serious threats than verbal harassment from untested sailors. Phase 3, Hartwell announced, his voice tight with frustration as his carefully planned psychological assault failed to produce the desired results. Contact stress evaluation. This was the culmination of his strategy. The moment when legitimate training would provide cover for the kind of physical intimidation that would finally break Riley's facade of competence. Under the guise of close-quarters combat training, Hartwell intended to subject her to increasingly aggressive physical contact until she either submitted or fought back inappropriately, either response serving his purposes. Combat situations involve physical contact, he explained to his audience, positioning himself directly across from Riley on the training mat. Sailors must be able to function effectively despite being grabbed, pushed, or otherwise physically engaged by hostile forces. We're going to test Petty Officer Dawson's ability to maintain tactical awareness under these conditions. Riley stood in the center of the mat, hands at her sides, breathing steady despite the obvious exhaustion from the previous phases of Hartwell's demonstration. Around her, the circle of observers had grown silent. Sensing that the afternoon was approaching some kind of climactic moment, Chief Williams leaned forward in his observation position, his hand moving unconsciously toward the emergency communication device that would summon medical personnel and senior staff if the situation deteriorated beyond acceptable limits. Every indicator suggested that Hartwell was about to cross a line that would have consequences far beyond whatever personal satisfaction he might gain from humiliating Riley. The key to this exercise, Hartwell continued, now addressing Riley directly rather than his audience, is learning to respond appropriately to physical pressure. Some people think that remaining passive makes them appear disciplined. But in actual combat situations, passivity gets people killed. He stepped closer to Riley, invading her personal space in a way that would have made most people uncomfortable. Riley simply adjusted her stance slightly, maintaining balance without retreating or showing any sign of intimidation. The question, Hartwell said, his voice dropping to a more personal tone, is whether you'll respond like a warrior or like someone who spent too much time hiding behind a desk. What happened next would be debated and analyzed in naval circles for years afterward. But the immediate witnesses would all agree on one crucial detail. Hartwell struck first. And Riley's response was purely defensive, The lieutenant commander's hand shot forward in what he would later claim was a legitimate training contact, but which looked to every observer like a deliberate attempt to strike Riley in the face. His palm connected with her jaw with a sharp crack that echoed through the stunned silence of the training facility. For one heartbeat, Riley's head turned with the impact. For another, she remained perfectly still, her green eyes fixed on Hartwell's face with an expression that made several witnesses take an involuntary step backward. Then she moved, and everything changed forever the moment Riley moved. The fundamental nature of reality inside the training facility shifted like a seismic event, rewriting the landscape. What the assembled witnesses saw was impossible to fully process in real time, a sequence of movements so fluid and precise that they seemed to bend the laws of physics around the simple principle that Derek Hartwell no longer had any choice in what happened to his body. Riley's response wasn't angry or emotional. It was surgical. Her left hand intercepted Hartwell's retreating arm at the wrist, not grabbing but guiding, redirecting the energy of his strike back toward him with the kind of leverage that turned his own strength into her advantage. Her right hand found his elbow, applying pressure at an angle that spoke to anatomical knowledge most people didn't possess. Her foot swept behind his heel at the exact moment his balance shifted forward, and gravity did the rest. Hartwell went down hard, his back hitting the mat with a sound like thunder in the sudden silence. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a harsh gasp that echoed through the facility, but Riley was already moving, flowing into a position that pinned him to the floor with what appeared to be minimal effort, but was clearly absolute control. Her knee rested lightly against his solar plexus, not enough to cause damage but positioned precisely to control his breathing and movement. Her hand found a pressure point beneath his jaw that made any struggle inadvisable, holding him in place with the kind of restraint that suggested extensive training in subduing larger, stronger opponents. "Sir," Riley said calmly, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the stunned facility, "I recommend you stop struggling and focus on controlling your breathing." The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was the complete suspension of normal reality. 200 sailors stood frozen, their minds trying to process what they had just witnessed. The impossible had become fact. Their arrogant instructor lay helpless beneath someone half his size, controlled by a woman he had been systematically harassing for weeks. Chief Williams found himself gripping the railing of the observation deck, his knuckles white with tension. In 30 years of naval service, he had never seen anything quite like what had just transpired. Riley's technique wasn't standard military combatives. It was something far more sophisticated, executed with the kind of precision that came from extensive practice under actual threat conditions. Hartwell tried to speak, tried to move, tried to reassert some semblance of authority, but Riley's positioning made any resistance futile. His face flushed red as he struggled against constraints that seemed impossibly gentle, yet absolutely unbreakable. "Breathe slowly," Riley instructed, her tone carrying the kind of authority that made people obey automatically. "The pressure you're feeling will pass if you don't fight it." The visiting officers leaned forward in their seats, recognizing technique that went far beyond anything taught in standard naval training programs. One, a commander with special warfare background, whispered to his colleague, "That's not academy training. That's something else entirely." Seaman Morrison stared at the scene unfolding before him, finally understanding why Riley had seemed so calm throughout Hartwell's campaign of harassment. She hadn't been enduring the abuse, she had been allowing it, waiting to see how far he would push before she was forced to reveal capabilities that her personnel file couldn't explain. Riley maintained the restraint for exactly as long as necessary to make her point, then gradually released the pressure. She didn't stand over Hartwell in triumph or make any gesture that could be interpreted as disrespectful. Instead, she simply stepped back 2 paces and returned to attention. Hands clasped behind her back, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Hartwell rolled to his side, gasping for air and trying to understand how the demonstration he had orchestrated had turned into his own public humiliation. His shoulder ached from the takedown. His throat felt tender where Riley's hand had controlled his breathing. And his ego lay in ruins somewhere on the training mat. "Sir," Riley said quietly, "are you injured?" The question was perfectly professional, delivered without sarcasm or malice, but it carried an undertone that made everyone present understand exactly what had happened. Riley hadn't lost control or responded emotionally to provocation. She had simply demonstrated that Hartwell's assumptions about her capabilities were dangerously incorrect. As Hartwell struggled to his feet, his face burning with embarrassment and confusion, the assembled sailors began to process the implications of what they had witnessed. Their understanding of Riley Dawson underwent a fundamental revision, shifting from mystery to something approaching awe. "That was unexpected," muttered one of the visiting officers. Though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect that Riley's response had been anything but unexpected for her, Chief Williams made a decision that would define the remainder of his naval career. Instead of allowing the situation to deteriorate further, he activated his communication device and summoned senior staff to the training facility. Whatever was about to unfold, it needed official oversight before Hartwell's wounded pride led him to make an even more catastrophic mistake. Riley remained at attention, her breathing controlled and her expression neutral, as if the previous 60 seconds had been routine rather than revelatory. She showed no signs of satisfaction or triumph, just the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout weeks of systematic harassment. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the facility. The other sailors looked at her differently now, their expressions carrying a mixture of respect and curiosity that hadn't been there before. They had seen their quiet, mysterious colleague demonstrate capabilities that raised questions about everything they thought they knew about her. Background. Hartwell finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper rather than his usual commanding tone. "You! That was... How did you..." Riley's response was as measured as everything else about her. "Sir, I've had extensive training in personal defense techniques. I apologize if my response was excessive, but I felt the need to protect myself when the demonstration became physical." The words were perfectly chosen to deflect responsibility while making it clear that she had acted defensively rather than aggressively. They also carried an implicit warning that Hartwell would be wise to reconsider any plans for continued harassment. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the facility, senior staff responding to Chief Williams's summons, Riley remained motionless at the center of the mat. Around her, the circle of witnesses struggled to process what they had seen and what it meant for their understanding of the woman who had just demonstrated that appearances could be profoundly deceiving. The real revelation was still to come. But already the whispers were beginning. Who was Riley Dawson? Where had she learned to move like that? And what other secrets lay hidden beneath her calm, professional exterior? The answers would reshape everything the base thought it knew about strength, competence, and the warriors who walked among them in silence. But first, they would have to survive the questions that were about to be asked by officers, whose job it was to uncover truths that personnel files couldn't reveal. Physical evidence emerged like fragments of a classified puzzle scattered across Riley's daily routine, each piece small enough to dismiss individually but collectively forming a picture that challenged everything her personnel file claimed about her background. It began with Seaman Morrison's sharp eyes during a routine gear inspection, when Riley's sleeve rode up slightly as she reached for equipment. Stored on a high shelf, the tattoo was barely visible, a small section of black ink that appeared to be part of a larger design hidden beneath her uniform. Morrison caught only a glimpse, but what he saw made his breath catch. The distinctive outline of what looked like a naval special warfare insignia, aged and faded in a way that spoke to years of exposure to salt water and harsh conditions. "Did you see that?" Morrison whispered to his bunkmate that evening, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the barracks. "See what?" "Dawson's got ink on her forearm. Looked like, I don't know, something military. Something official." The observation might have been dismissed as imagination, if not for what Petty Officer Martinez discovered 2 days later during mail call. Riley's correspondence always arrived with the same clinical efficiency that characterized everything else about her official Navy communications. Training bulletins, nothing personal or revealing. But Martinez, sorting mail for the administrative office, noticed something unusual about one particular envelope. The return address bore the distinctive logo of Naval Special Warfare Command. Not unusual in itself, many sailors received communications from various Navy commands, but this letter was marked with classification indicators that suggested content far beyond routine administrative correspondence. More significantly, it was addressed to Riley using a different rank designation than what appeared on her current orders. Martinez felt his hands tremble slightly as he delivered the mail to Riley's quarters. She accepted the correspondence with the same neutral expression she gave everything else, but he caught a brief flash of something in her eyes when she saw the NSWC envelope. Not surprise, but recognition. The look of someone receiving expected communication from a familiar source. "Everything all right with your mail, Petty Officer?" Martinez asked, fishing for information. Riley's response was characteristically minimal. Standard administrative follow-up. Nothing urgent. But Martinez noticed how carefully she secured the envelope in her personal locker, placing it in a position that suggested it contained something more significant than routine paperwork. The brief glimpse he caught of the letters, classification marking, indicated information that required security clearances far above what any administrative specialist should possess. The revelations continued during the following week's medical training exercise. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Jennifer Hayes was conducting routine first aid instruction when she noticed Riley's unusual proficiency with advanced trauma procedures. While other sailors struggled with basic wound care techniques, Riley demonstrated knowledge of surgical protocols typically reserved for specially trained medical personnel. "Where did you learn that particular suturing technique?" Hayes asked after Riley had perfectly executed a complex closure procedure during the simulation. "Previous training," Riley replied with her standard deflection. But Hayes noticed the precision of her hand movements and the confidence with which she handled medical instruments. This wasn't academic knowledge, it was muscle memory developed through extensive practical application. Hayes, who had served with special operations medical personnel during her previous assignment, recognized the signs of someone who had received training far beyond standard Navy medical courses. The way Riley checked for secondary injuries, her systematic approach to triage, her familiarity with emergency protocols all suggested experience with trauma medicine in high-stress operational environments. "Have you considered applying for advanced medical training?" Hayes asked. "You've got natural aptitude for this work." Riley's smile was polite but distant. "I'm content with my current assignments." "Corpsman," the response was perfectly professional. But Hayes caught something in Riley's tone that suggested she was vastly underqualified for whatever training she had actually received. It was the voice of someone humoring a well-meaning colleague who didn't understand the full scope of her background. The most revealing incident occurred during a routine security drill designed to test the base's response to simulated terrorist infiltration. The exercise called for sailors to identify and report suspicious activities while maintaining normal operations. But Riley's performance transcended the training. scenario entirely. She moved through the drill with the systematic awareness of someone who had conducted actual counter-surveillance operations, identifying threats that other participants missed, and demonstrating knowledge of security protocols that weren't part of standard Navy training. Her tactical thinking was several levels above what any administrative specialist should possess. Chief Williams observed the exercise from the command center, watching Riley coordinate with other sailors in a way that suggested extensive experience with small unit operations. Her communications were economical and precise, using terminology that indicated familiarity with special operations procedures. "She's done this before," Williams muttered to his assistant, noting how Riley positioned herself to maintain observation angles while appearing to follow routine duties. Not exercises, real operations. When the drill concluded, Riley submitted an after-action report that analyzed the exercise with the kind of tactical sophistication that impressed even the security specialists conducting the evaluation. Her recommendations for improving base security demonstrated understanding of vulnerabilities and countermeasures that went far beyond what her supposed background could explain. The accumulating evidence created an undercurrent of speculation that rippled through the base's informal communication networks. Sailors who had dismissed Riley as just another quiet administrative transfer began reassessing their assumptions about her background and capabilities. The woman who had so effortlessly controlled Lieutenant Commander Hartwell was clearly far more than her personnel file suggested. Seaman Morrison began keeping an informal log of Riley's unusual competencies, documenting incidents that suggested training and experience that didn't match her official record. The list grew steadily: advanced knowledge of maritime navigation, familiarity with classified communication protocols, demonstration of combat skills during training exercises, understanding of intelligence gathering techniques. Each piece of evidence was circumstantial individually, but collectively they painted a picture of someone whose real background had been carefully obscured by bureaucratic sanitization, the kind of record cleaning typically reserved for personnel transitioning out of highly classified programs. "She's not who she pretends to be," Morrison confided to Chief Williams during a private conversation. "And I don't think Lieutenant Commander Hartwell has any idea what he's dealing with." Williams found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His suspicions about Riley's background were solidifying into near certainty, but he lacked the clearance or authority to access whatever classified records might explain her true history. Meanwhile, Hartwell's campaign of harassment continued to escalate, driven by wounded pride and complete ignorance of the danger he was courting. The situation felt like watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. An arrogant officer systematically provoking someone whose real capabilities remained hidden but whose restraint might not be infinite. Williams had seen enough evidence to know that Riley Dawson was far more dangerous than she appeared, but he also understood that official channels offered no mechanism for preventing the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. As the base buzzed with whispered speculation about the mysterious petty officer who had humiliated their training instructor, Riley maintained her routine with the same calm professionalism she had displayed from the beginning. She showed no awareness of the attention her actions had generated, no sign that she cared about the theories circulating regarding her background, but those who watched her carefully noticed subtle changes in her behavior, small adjustments that suggested someone preparing for a situation that might require her to abandon the careful anonymity she had maintained since arriving at Riverside. The way she positioned herself during formations, her increased attention to potential security threats, her systematic assessment of personnel and facilities. Riley Dawson was getting ready for something, even if no one else understood what that something might be. The official revelation arrived at 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide the history of Riverside Naval Base into before and after. Captain Sarah Chun stepped through the doors of the training facility with the kind of purposeful stride that made junior officers check their uniforms and senior enlisted personnel mentally review their recent decisions. Her presence wasn't announced by fanfare or ceremony. It didn't need to be. Authority at her level carried its own gravitational field. Behind her walked a figure that made Chief Williams's blood pressure spike the moment he recognized the uniform. Insignia: Master Chief Petty Officer James Kellerman, Naval Special Warfare Command. His presence at a routine training base could mean only one thing: someone's carefully maintained cover was about to be blown wide open. The morning formation proceeded with mechanical precision until Captain Chun stepped forward to address the assembled personnel. Her voice carried the kind of clarity that cut through ambient noise and nervous tension alike, demanding attention through competence rather than volume. This morning we're here to address certain irregularities that have come to our attention. Regarding recent training incidents, she began, her gaze sweeping across the formation until it settled on Lieutenant Commander Hartwell. Specifically, allegations of inappropriate conduct during combat readiness exercises. Hartwell felt his stomach drop as he realized that his systematic harassment of Riley had attracted attention from command levels he hadn't considered. Visiting officers who had witnessed his humiliation had apparently filed reports that climbed the chain of command faster than he could have imagined. However, Captain Chun continued, before we address those matters, we need to correct certain misconceptions that have influenced recent events at this facility. Williams found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His suspicions about Riley's background were solidifying into near certainty, but he lacked the clearance or authority to access whatever classified records might explain her true history. Meanwhile, Hartwell's campaign of harassment continued to escalate, driven by wounded pride and complete ignorance of the danger he was courting. The situation felt like watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, an arrogant officer systematically provoking someone whose real capabilities remained hidden but whose restraint might not be infinite. Williams had seen enough evidence to know that Riley Dawson was far more dangerous than she appeared, but he also understood that official channels offered no mechanism for preventing the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. As the base buzzed with whispered speculation about the mysterious petty officer who had humiliated their training instructor, Riley maintained her routine with the same calm professionalism she had displayed from the beginning. She showed no awareness of the attention her actions had generated, no sign that she cared about the theories circulating regarding her background, but those who watched her carefully noticed subtle changes in her behavior, small adjustments that suggested someone preparing for a situation that might require her to abandon the careful anonymity she had maintained since arriving at Riverside. The way she positioned herself during formations, her increased attention to potential security threats, her systematic assessment of personnel and facilities. Riley Dawson was getting ready for something, even if no one else understood what that something might be. The official revelation arrived at 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide the history of Riverside Naval Base into before and after. Captain Sarah Chun stepped through the doors of the training facility with the kind of purposeful stride that made junior officers check their uniforms and senior enlisted personnel mentally review their recent decisions. Her presence wasn't announced by fanfare or ceremony. It didn't need to be. Authority at her level carried its own gravitational field. Behind her walked a figure that made Chief Williams's blood pressure spike the moment he recognized the uniform. Insignia: Master Chief Petty Officer James Kellerman, Naval Special Warfare Command. His presence at a routine training base could mean only one thing: someone's carefully maintained cover was about to be blown wide open. The morning formation proceeded with mechanical precision until Captain Chun stepped forward to address the assembled personnel. Her voice carried the kind of clarity that cut through ambient noise and nervous tension alike, demanding attention through competence rather than volume. This morning we're here to address certain irregularities that have come to our attention. Regarding recent training incidents, she began, her gaze sweeping across the formation until it settled on Lieutenant Commander Hartwell. Specifically, allegations of inappropriate conduct during combat readiness exercises. Hartwell felt his stomach drop as he realized that his systematic harassment of Riley had attracted attention from command levels he hadn't considered. Visiting officers who had witnessed his humiliation had apparently filed reports that climbed the chain of command faster than he could have imagined. However, Captain Chun continued, before we address those matters, we need to correct certain misconceptions that have influenced recent events at this facility. She turned her attention to Riley, who stood at attention in the formation with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout weeks of harassment and speculation. Petty Officer First Class Riley Dawson, front and center. Riley stepped forward with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times in situations far more consequential than a morning formation. She positioned herself exactly where protocol demanded, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed straight ahead. Captain Chun opened a tablet and began reading from what was clearly an official record, her voice carrying enough authority to silence even the ambient sounds of the base around them. Service record reflects assignment to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as DevGru, from 2018 to 2023. 7 combat deployments across 3 theaters of operation. Specialized training in maritime operations, close quarters combat, advanced weapon systems, and classified intelligence gathering techniques. The words hit the formation like physical blows, each revelation rewriting their understanding of the woman who had been living among them for months. The quiet administrative specialist who had endured weeks of harassment was actually one of the most elite warriors the Navy produced. Unit citations include the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during classified operations in the Mediterranean, 2 Silver Stars for combat operations in the Pacific Theater, and the Purple Heart for wounds sustained during direct action missions. Master Chief Kellerman stepped forward, his weathered face carrying the kind of expression reserved for moments of profound respect. In 30 years of special warfare operations, he had seen heroes come and go, but Riley Dawson represented something rare even in that exclusive community. Chief Petty Officer Dawson, he said, using her actual rank rather than the cover identity she had maintained at Riverside, served as team leader for some of the most sensitive operations conducted by Naval Special Warfare during the past 5 years. Her tactical expertise and leadership under extreme conditions saved the lives of dozens of American service members and allied personnel. The formation remained frozen in stunned silence as the implications of these revelations settled into their consciousness. Every interaction they had witnessed between Riley and Hartwell was now recontextualized through the lens of her true background. Her restraint wasn't weakness, it was the discipline of someone who understood exactly how much damage she could inflict if she chose to abandon that restraint. Chief Dawson is currently assigned to the war was over. The real challenge was just beginning. The transformation of Riverside Naval Base began within hours of Captain Chun's revelation and continued for months afterward, reshaping not just policies and procedures, but the fundamental culture of respect that governed interactions between personnel. The story of Chief Riley Dawson became more than base legend. It evolved into a teaching tool that influenced naval training protocols across the Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant Commander Derek Hartwell's reassignment came through official channels within 72 hours, accompanied by fitness reports that effectively ended any hope of career advancement. His transfer to a desk position at Naval Personnel Command in Washington carried the kind of bureaucratic language that ensured everyone who read his file would understand exactly why he had been removed from operational command. The Navy's institutional memory was long and unforgiving when it came to officers who demonstrated such profound failures of judgment and leadership. Williams found himself promoted to senior instructor for combat readiness training, with specific mandate to develop new protocols that emphasized respect for all personnel, regardless of apparent background or experience. His first official act was to institute mandatory briefings on the fine dangers of assumptions and the importance of treating every sailor as potentially possessing capabilities that transcended their official job descriptions. "You never know who you're training with" became Williams's signature phrase during these sessions. The person next to you might have saved lives in places you've never heard of, under conditions you can't imagine. Treat everyone with the respect due to a warrior, because you might be standing next to one. The training facility itself underwent both physical and symbolic changes that reflected the base's new understanding of leadership and competence. The spot where Hartwell had struck Riley and been immediately controlled in response was marked with a small brass plaque that reads simply, "Respect is earned through character, not rank." It became known throughout the fleet as Dawson Point, visited by sailors from other commands who came to hear the story firsthand. Riley's presence at Riverside transformed from mysterious anomaly to inspirational catalyst. Her true background, now officially acknowledged, made her the most decorated active duty service member on the base. But she wore that distinction with the same quiet professionalism she had maintained as an unknown administrative specialist. Her training methods became legendary for their effectiveness and their emphasis on building competence, rather than breaking spirit. That young sailors who struggled with confidence found themselves drawn to her calm guidance. She had a gift for identifying the specific encouragement each person needed, whether it was technical instruction or simply the assurance that everyone started somewhere and improvement came through persistent effort rather than natural talent. "Chief Dawson saved my career," Seaman Morrison would tell people years later. "Not through any dramatic intervention, but by showing me that strength wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. She taught me that competence speaks for itself if you let it, and that real leadership comes from helping others succeed rather than proving your own superiority." The ripple effects extended far beyond Riverside. Riley's story became part of leadership development curricula at the Naval Academy and senior enlisted schools, used to illustrate the dangers of prejudgment and the importance of recognizing talent in unexpected places. Her transition from classified special operations to conventional training command became a model for how the Navy could better utilize the expertise of special warfare veterans. Master Chief Kellerman visited Riverside quarterly to check on Riley's adjustment and to observe the cultural changes her presence had inspired. During one such visit, he found himself watching her conduct a class on tactical awareness for junior sailors, noting how she commanded attention through competence rather than intimidation. "You've found your calling here," he told her afterward as they walked along the base perimeter. "These kids are getting world-class instruction from someone who's actually done what she's teaching." Riley's response reflected the wisdom she had gained through her unique journey from classified operations to public service. "Everyone has something valuable to contribute. My job isn't to impress them with what I've done, it's to help them discover what they're capable of doing." The lesson resonated throughout the naval community, where Riley's story became synonymous with the principle that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources if given proper recognition and support. Her transition from hidden warrior to acknowledged leader demonstrated that the military's greatest strength lay not in rigid hierarchies but in its ability to adapt and learn from its own personnel. Captain Chun's final report on the Riverside incident became required reading for command staff. Throughout the Pacific Fleet, her analysis focused on the institutional failures that had allowed Hartwell's harassment to continue unchecked and the systematic changes needed to prevent similar incidents from occurring in other commands. The case of Chief Dawson illustrates both the best and worst of military culture, Chun wrote. Her restraint and professionalism under systematic harassment exemplify the highest standards of naval service. Lieutenant Commander Hartwell's conduct represents the kind of leadership failure that weakens our entire institution. The difference between them wasn't rank or position, it was character and competence. Years later, when Riley finally retired from active duty, her farewell ceremony at Riverside drew attendees from across the naval special warfare community. Former teammates who had served with her in classified operations stood alongside junior sailors, whose careers she had shaped through her teaching and example. The keynote address was delivered by Admiral Patricia Rodriguez, commander of Naval Special Warfare, who had flown in specifically to honor Riley's unique contribution to naval service. Her words captured the essence of what made Riley's story so significant to the broader military community. Chief Dawson represents the best of what we strive to be, Admiral Rodriguez told the assembled crowd. Not because of the medals she earned or the operations she completed, but because of how she chose to serve when those achievements could have been her shield against lesser challenges. She could have revealed her background the moment harassment began, could have used her reputation to demand the respect she deserved. Instead, she chose to earn that respect through her actions and character, teaching all of us that true strength lies in choosing the harder path when the easier one is available. Riley's response to the tribute was characteristic in its brevity and focus on others rather than herself. "I've been privileged to serve alongside heroes in every assignment I've held," she said. "The sailors I've trained here at Riverside are no different from the teammates I served with in special operations. They're people who chose to put service above self, who understand that strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. That's the real lesson of military service, and it's one I'll carry with me long after I take off this uniform." As the ceremony concluded and Riley walked away from active duty, she left behind a legacy that extended far beyond her classified operational achievements. She had demonstrated that heroism could take many forms, that leadership was about character rather than position, and that the greatest victories sometimes came not from defeating enemies but from transforming the culture and consciousness of those who served alongside her. The story of Chief Riley Dawson became more than military legend. It became a reminder that excellence often walks among us quietly, waiting not for recognition, but for the opportunity to serve something greater than itself. In a world that often confused noise with strength and position with authority, her example stood as proof that true leadership requires nothing more than competence, character, and the courage to do what's right regardless of personal cost. The lesson continues to echo through naval training facilities around the world, carried forward by sailors who understand that respect is indeed earned through character, not rank, and that the most dangerous people are often the quietest ones in the room. If you believe respect should be earned, not demanded, leave a like below. And if this story of quiet strength and hidden heroism moved you, subscribe to Valor Chronicles for more true tales of courage that remind us what real leadership looks like. Because these aren't just stories, they're lessons in character that the world needs now more than ever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.